Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the fourth installment in PYXERA Global's Rhetoric to Action series. Today we'll be speaking about commitments in action, delivering on statements toward achieving racial justice. For those of you who have been joining us since the beginning, you know that our conversations aim to inspire the development of informed and intentional programming and initiatives, simply stated, actions that lead to solutions toward dismantling structural racism. One of the things that I enjoy most about our conversation is that we often bring the overlooked perspectives to the tables. We've had conversation with leaders from community, from business around the globe, and we aim to include voices from all sectors as much as possible at the same time, at the same table, as best we can. And today is a perfect illustration of that. I am thrilled to have friends from 3M and friends from North Carolina A&T State University, which is a historically Black college and university classified as an HBCU. So I am thrilled to hear their perspectives today. You are in for a treat. For those of you who are new to the conversation, you can view the past recordings on our website, which I believe you should see in the chat. So you'll see the last 3 conversations that we've had. Please do take a look at the summary and get up to speed. So today, as I mentioned, we are talking about what actions have specifically been taken in the last year toward dismantling structural racism and, equally as important, achieving racial justice. Several organizations, corporations in particular, have made public statements announcing what they plan to do, along with some significant financial commitments, all of which is fantastic. But then some of those commitments have gone toward HBCUs, which we'll hear more about today. Other commitments have gone toward nonprofits and community-based organizations as well. Now, while some of these organizations or companies have started to put action toward their commitments, if we're being honest, we know that several have not. Now, I'm not here to support cancel culture. I'm not here to call anyone out, but what I am here is to support accountability. And I am here to support knowledge sharing and partnership. And what I'm also here to support is the fact that you have to take a step. It takes one step at a time, and hopefully together we can take those steps toward change. This is difficult work, and it's often uncomfortable at best. This work requires introspection, both personally and at the organizational level, and it requires decisions to be made, and hard decisions to be made, and changes that result from those hard decisions that are made. Not easy stuff. And it will take time. It will take a lot of time. We acknowledge that. But 3M is one of those organizations. They're doing it. They're starting to do the hard work. And so excited to speak with them today to hear what they are doing and what that looks like. And in the spirit of learning and collective action, we also want to hear what's not working. What have you tried? What are some of the lessons learned along the way? We also want to hear, what do you wish other people knew as they take their journey? So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Before I invite them to speak, you'll see on the slide here that our social media handles are visible. I will not keep this slide up the entire duration of the conversation, so please make note of the handles. Get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you both during the conversation and afterwards. So from 3M, our long-term PYXERA Global corporate partner, we have Garfield Bowen, who's the Director of Social Justice Strategy and Initiatives. Welcome, Garfield.
Thank you.
We have Scott Morris, Strategist for Diversity and Inclusion. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Renee.
Thank you. And then from longtime 3M partner and hopefully soon to be new PYXERA Global partner in some capacity, we have North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, also known as North Carolina A&T, and a distinguished HBCU, as I mentioned. Dr. Robin Coger, Dean of the College of Engineering. Welcome, Dr. Coger.
Thank you.
And Dr. Kevin James, Dean of the College of Business and Economics. Welcome, Dr. James.
Thank you.
Excellent. So I will stop sharing now and let's dive into this conversation. Let's get started. All of you who are listening in, I invite you to engage in the chat, speak with each other. If you have questions for our panelists throughout the conversation, please do drop it in the chat. Let us know. We'll be peppering them throughout the conversation, and then we'll have a designated time at the end to address those that we didn't get throughout the conversation. All right, let's dive in. Garfield, I'd like to begin with you. In the past year, 3M has made some significant investments, both financially and in terms of philanthropic dollars, and structurally in terms of reconfiguring the internal corporate structure, essentially, all toward us accelerating social justice and eliminating, and I'm using quotes, internal systemic barriers. I'd like to speak about those internal adjustments, if you will. Your role, the role that you sit in now, is one of the newly created roles as a result of those internal changes. So can you share more about these changes and what is it that 3M aims to achieve through these changes?
Well, thank you, Renee. It is a delight to share this virtual stage with my esteemed colleague, Scott, from 3M, and our newest partners on our equity journey, Deans Coger and James. The heartbreak that was 2020 with the unfortunate tragedy of George Floyd's killing sent ripples through our headquarters cities. It sent ripples through our state, our nation, and quite frankly, the globe. And so we needed to turn that heartbreak into defining a new way towards equity for all. And 3M's leadership stepped up in many ways. And one of the ways, as you've articulated, Renee, is the creation of my position. And my position was created to orchestrate a movement across the company to drive a social justice agenda in a way that would persist for time to come. The decision was also made to address this agenda as a business imperative. And as such, our leadership not only appointed me, but appointed over 90 individuals on lateral assignments supporting 10 enterprise work streams to drive this ambitious body of work. In December, 3M went another step further by creating a new equity and community organization led by our new Chief Equity Officer, James Moman, which I believe is an innovative org design model that brings together our diversity, equity, and inclusion organization, our 3M Gives organization, which is our philanthropic arm, and the social justice to support our goals and commitments to do a couple of things. It's to drive equity. That's a broad agenda. To drive equity in our workplaces, through our business practices, and in our communities globally.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I do have a couple follow-up questions, as you can imagine. One of the things that you had mentioned is for 3M, this has become an enterprise-wide initiative. We're aiming to integrate this, and when I say this, I mean equity across the entire organization. That's not an easy thing to do. Oftentimes we find that initiatives of diversity and inclusion are siloed. They might sit in HR and HR is meant to come in and do a diversity and inclusion and make it happen. We know that that's not how it works. And for change to be sustainable, it needs to be integrated, through every aspect of the business. So can you tell us a little bit about how 3M has navigated that integration and what are some of the stumbling blocks and lessons learned along that journey?
No, that's another great question, right? So I think, you are right. I mean, DE&I efforts will fall flat, if by itself. And so there has to be intentionality in designing our work and our ecosystem in a way that's going to be lasting, for time and time to come. And so one of the things that we did early, right, because I also want to acknowledge that what we're doing now is building upon a good foundation that was laid years ago. When Mike Roman was named the CEO, one of the things that happened shortly thereafter was a cultural reset. And coming out of that, powered by inclusion became one of our 5 cultural elements for our company. And so the work again that we lead today is building up on that. And so the activation of DE&I, takes everyone, for us to make a difference. And so a couple of things that we've done. We have inclusion champions appointed for each of our 4 business groups. We have inclusion champions across all of our functional areas. And in addition to that, we have 14 exceptionally engaged employee resource networks whose leaders all have FaceTime with our CEO quarterly to have candid conversations, about race and about how they advance, their agenda through action planning. And this body of knowledge, this body of work is guided by the leadership of Scott, who will speak more about the ERNs. A couple other things I'll probably want to share as we talk about rewiring the enterprise to actually, drive this ambitious agenda towards equity. One of the work streams that we have, implemented is called business group engagement, and it's that for a reason. It's about how do we leverage the full capability, of our company to drive equity in the places and spaces that we occupy. So you see, everyone is playing their role, right? From healthcare to transportation, electronics to, consumer, to safety and industrial. We are all playing our part using that capability to drive an equity agenda. So it can't be, yes, we need a home for, diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice, and that home is in HR, but we are just architects. We're orchestrating across the company in an intentional way to drive sustainable long-term impact.
Excellent, thank you for that. So on the point of driving long-term sustainable impact, how do you measure that? How do you know in 5 years, in 10 years, in 1 year, the needle has been moved and things are actually changing and driving toward that sustained impact that we're hoping for?
Yeah, great question, right? With increased transparency comes increased accountability. And so we're committed to increasing that transparency. And we just a few weeks ago published our first ever global diversity, equity, and inclusion report that kind of goes behind the curtains a little bit and showed, exposed our reality, right? And we're a huge global company. We have, probably more conservative, right? So it was a huge step for us to share with the world our reality, where we're at in terms of representation, some of the challenges that we face. And so we've articulated that. And, we also shared with our colleagues across the globe, what's our agenda for the year, right? We've said, this is what we're going to accomplish, right? We've committed that we're going to be doubling our pipeline of talent across all dimensions of diversity globally. We've announced that we're going to be doubling our representation of Black, Hispanic, and, populations at all levels of our company. We're going to be doubling our STEM education investment. And we're also going to be doubling our investment with diverse suppliers. So we've communicated that we're going to do this. Now it's time to measure. We're going to be measuring how we're making progress across these dimensions. And not only measuring just by the numbers, but one of the things I'm working with some of our partners on, at 3M, is how do we measure the impact, right? North Carolina A&T is here at the table, and I'm super excited because we're talking about transforming lives. And transforming lives is not just looking at a number or a single data point, right? It's really following a journey, of the life of an individual through an ecosystem of creating social capital. And that's what we're about. We're about the staying power, going the distance, and ensuring that we're doing this in an intentional way. So while we don't have it all figured out, I think we've got the right partners at the table to help us on this journey as we go forward with increased transparency and accountability, Renay.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So many things that I want to pull the thread on a little bit there. I appreciate you beginning with transparency equals accountability. I appreciate you acknowledging that we don't have it all figured out. That's okay. I don't believe that anyone is expected to have it all figured out. It's about taking the steps and learning along the way. And as you said, bringing the right partners to the table to learn together and take the steps on that journey together. Appreciate that. The other thing that I appreciate that you mentioned is it's not just about data points. Yes, we have to make decisions based on data, but data is not where it stops. Data should inform, how we might maneuver, but it's really about individual lives. It's really about people. It's about systems and structures and how they affect those people. So I appreciate you for mentioning that. One of the other things, and I'll take you off the hot seat after this question, but one of the other questions that I have for you is you mentioned the diversity, equity, and inclusion report that I believe can be found in the chat for our audience. But you had mentioned global workforce, and that's one of the things that really struck me as well. We know that matters of race and social injustices are not just US issues. They are issues that affect our entire globe, our entire planet, and on differing levels and varying dimensions based on the local context. So can you tell us a little bit about how 3M is addressing the global workforce and localizing some of the challenges that they're facing and helping empower, local staff to partner to develop solutions?
Hey, you're absolutely right, Renee. You know, in other parts of the world, while racial barriers may not be the social justice issue, there are challenges such as privilege, oppression, colorism that are prominent. And
Mhm.
so our equity framework that we've designed, again, to drive equity in our workplaces, through our business practices, and in our communities globally, you know, is set up in such a way that it can be adapted to the unique challenges of the areas across the world where we have a presence. Because you're right, the movement, you know, of the tragedy of George Floyd's death, you know, again, sent ripples, and it you know, pulled all of us to the table. You know, last summer we had over 5,000 3Mers globally gathered virtually to discuss the impact of the tragedy. You know, one of the work streams as well leads what we call a racial inclusion advocacy sessions, and over
Mhm.
1,700 people, leaders, were involved in those conversations. For the first time in our company's history, we were
Mhm.
talking about race, we were talking about racism, and we were talking about how do we become an anti-racist enterprise. And it's going to take each of us to be able to do that. At the start of this year, we had another 500 employees engaged in these racial inclusion advocacy sessions. We recognize now that as we intentionally decide, you know, started here in the US, we now needed to expand this work globally. So we're currently retooling that body of work, yeah, and rebranding it to be called the social justice advocacy, so that it's more relevant to the challenges that our colleagues face across the globe. So I just wanted to offer that as, you know, just an example or a proof point that, you know, we've been able to do it well here in the US. How now do we deploy this more, on a more global scale? You know, we
Mhm.
also have content, around learning and development. That's going to be global. I mentioned earlier, our business group engagement work is global. Our businesses are global. And so we want to make sure that we're leveraging those capabilities in the places and spaces that we occupy. And one other thing I'll mention is around, we're an innovation company, and we have what we call our new product introduction process, and that's a process that governs how we ideate and through to commercialize new products. And we're going through that process, and we're embedding into that process a racial equity lens, right? So that we're really seeking to be more intentional about how we're driving equity even through our innovation process. That's not a US issue, that's a global issue, and it will take all of us to be more intentional about that.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Garfield. Scott, I'd like to switch over to you. Garfield mentioned the employee resource networks, and I know you are instrumental in kind of leading the ERNs, as they're called, within 3M. So can you talk to us a little bit about the roles that the ERNs have played both on the philanthropic and structural fronts?
Yeah, I sure can. If I could just build on a couple of things that Garfield said, I think that are
Mhm.
really important, that I think will be helpful as I speak about the employee resource networks globally. We talked about metrics, and there's two other metrics that I think that are really important. That's a diversity index that was launched several years ago, as well as our inclusion index. And we're one of the only companies that we're aware of that has an inclusion index.
Mm.
And the reason that's so important is that really laid the groundwork and the framework, because we focused on everyone. And so that really helped create, and Mike Roman, when he was announced CEO, in his first sentence, he said, we're going to focus on diversity and inclusion. And that's when the CEO Inclusion Council was announced that Garfield mentioned. When we talk about the employee resource networks at 3M, they're global. And they've been around for 45 years. The African American Network will actually celebrate 45 years this year. And the role that they've played, these grassroots organizations, what we have done, we have created joint strategies so that they can see the intersectionality. So when I
Mhm.
think about this year and what they've done, it didn't start with the killing of George Floyd. It started last year, I would say, when they really started to see the common threads. They really started to focus on intersectionality. A great example of that is our Women's Leadership Forum. And I'm not saying this, but a lot of folks would say it, that a lot of folks view our Women's Leadership Forum as a white women's club. So well before George Floyd, they focused on intersectionality and the diversity of their board. And so when I think about the impact that the ERNs have had, I would say that we wouldn't be where we are today if it
Right.
wasn't for the ERNs. Garfield mentioned his 10 work streams. I said, wow, Garfield, that's a lot of work streams. But hey, Garfield can manage, and it's really come together in a really special way. But the ERNs are integrated on every level. When we think about Mike's town hall, his response to the killing of George Floyd, one of the proudest moments of my 3M life, when I heard my CEO say that we are going to be a culture of anti-racist, and we're going to root out inequities across the globe and in our communities. Well, as part of that panel were our ERNs. And so we had our AAN, our African American Network Chair. We had a VP, that's a coach, and they were magnificent. But what we also included was our Women's Leadership Forum Chair, our Latino Resource Network Chair. And they took that conversation, that weighty, difficult conversation, to a whole new level. Our Chief Diversity Officer, Ananias, said after that we moved a mountain today. Wow. We transformed the company today, and we couldn't have done it without you. You know, a lot of folks were wondering, what's 3M going to do as it relates to our response to social justice? Well, the first act was our Social Justice Fund, where $1 million went to the African American Network to decide who we could partner with. And what was beautiful about that, we incorporated 5 of the other ERNs to be a part of that decision-making process. So on so many levels, I would say, Renay, the ERNs are involved because this is a weighty topic. But the thing that 3M is doing, much different than when I started, is we're listening. Always would poll questions, but now we're listening. And the bridge from, in my mind, being stagnant or rhetoric to action is understanding. So we're listening, we're understanding, we're taking action, and we're allowing these powerful voices from our ERNs to really guide our strategic initiatives.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That is powerful. One of the things that resonated with me was, and I had to do a kind of a double take and I wrote it down. So 3M placed $1 million in the hands of the ERNs to help drive what organizations in the community should receive the funding. Did I understand that correctly?
That's absolutely right. And the beautiful part about that is through partnership, through collaboration, we had 3 options, or they had 3 options. And it wasn't one of the 3 options that we ended up going with. So that to me was powerful, and it speaks to collaboration and bringing in different perspectives. So that absolutely happened. I was the chair of the African American Network in 2015 when I wasn't in this role. And to have gotten $500 would have been a big deal. But to get $1 million and say, you do what you do, was amazing.
That's powerful. And I can imagine as an employee, in that network, I would feel proud and I would feel trusted. I would feel like my voice actually matters. If I'm now responsible to make a decision or influence, where my company spends this amount of money, that's significant to me. And I don't think that's something to be taken lightly.
So Renay, if I could just build on that just really quickly. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Creating that sense of belonging is so important, but you really don't truly start to believe until you see it, till you feel it, till action is actually happening and is tangible.
Yes, agreed. One of the other points that you mentioned, I just want to quickly touch on before we jump into kind of the illustration of the skills-based piece of and how the ERNs are integral in that. You mentioned intersectionality. I think that's something that's often overlooked in our conversations. We have, we look at different groups as monoliths, all Black people are this way, or all Asians are this way, or all, whatever way. But there's so many layers within our groups. We're individuals and we're all complex and so many different levels. And I appreciate you highlighting, when we talk about, and forgive me if I misrepresent the name, the Women's Leadership Network or the Women's Leadership Group.
Forum, yes.
Forum, and it's usually white women. Oftentimes when we think about diversity, it's Black men. Yeah. Or, when we have Blacks, it's Black men. And then the women are often left out. When we think about women, it's white women. So then Black women are often overlooked.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
We have to remember the intersectionality when we have these conversations, specifically regarding inclusion. Generally, we're talking about being inclusive, period. So that's including everyone. with everything
Absolutely.
in every aspect. So
You,
thank you
you know,
for
Renee,
sharing.
if I could just really hit that really quickly,
Yeah.
our employee research networks are open to everyone. So everyone can join. Where the intersection happens it wasn't Women's Leadership Forum fault that
No,
there weren't
right.
more people of color that were involved, because people tend to go to their culture, right? But where the common thread is, that where we intersect across all 9 of our ERNs, it's around development. So develop me so I can be a part of those promotion ready pipelines. It's around engagement. You know, who's advocating for me? Are we creating that safe space to create that sense of belonging and leaders with vulnerability? And then the last piece that you're transitioning to is community. How do we impact the community aligned to the goals of our 3M Gives and our foundation in a way that disrupts? So those are the common threads, the common tenets that bring them together.
So let me ask you a quick question. What do you think changed, or what is it that made employees feel more comfortable or more welcome to join other networks? Or, you know, you mentioned that oftentimes we go to, you know, groups where folks look like us, or, you know, where we feel more comfortable, but now you're starting to see greater dynamics and more diversity within the groups. So what is it that you think changed for people to feel more comfortable to start going? Or is it, you know, on the other side of the table, the invitations were extended, or?
I think it's an easy answer, in my opinion. You create value, they will come. You create measure value, they will come in flocks. If you create value aligned to the goals of like 3M Gives, our learning and talent development, right? Our D&I, everything is aligned. And that's one thing that we didn't really talk about, that alignment. It's purpose driven. Garfield mentioned a couple of things that were really important. Powered by inclusion. That could have been rhetoric.
Yeah.
But when you see the activations happening across the globe and the alignment, to me, that's the reason why. Is one, folks started to focus on inclusion, right? They started to reflect. That gave them awareness to really understand their own beliefs, their own identities, right? Until you get that awareness and you get to understanding, now you can take action. But I really believe it's the value that we were creating aligned to the corporate goals and initiatives. That's what brings people together.
Excellent. And before we dive in to speak with Dr. James and Dr. Coger, I know you were waiting with bated breath, ready to jump in. I do have one more question for Scott, and that's pulling the thread a little bit on the alignment piece that you had mentioned. And specifically the employee research networks as they're being engaged with skills-based pro bono programs.
Yes.
So we know that for 3M, one of the priorities has been to engage more employees using their skills to support nonprofits and help build the capacity of nonprofits, social enterprises, community health centers, and what have you. So can you talk a little bit about that alignment and how that has changed and shifted? I know there's a heavy focus on equity in healthcare now. So how has that changed and shifted, and how the ERN's instrumental in that?
Well, it actually goes back to 2017. That's where the change happened.
Okay.
I sat down with Michael Stroik, you know, Michael, our 3M Gives director, and we talked about how the ERNs could go to another level now that they're under D&I. We created the community champions, and the community champions were aligned with 3M Gives. Their priorities around creating value and serving underrepresented and under-resourced groups. And so I created these champions with the 9 ERNs, which never had done really volunteerism together, around creating and driving out those disparities. And we focused on education here in Minnesota, and we focused on homelessness. So those were really the 2 things that we did. But the other piece of it, it's great to go feed my starving children. We said it's going to be skill-based service, because when you do a 3M Impact program, you grow. That aligns right back with our development goals, right? And so that's what we did. It's all skill-based, and Garfield has a lot of the work streams. One of the work streams is the community coalition. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to expand and elevate the way we impact in response to our local community and align it to Garfield's work streams. So on so many levels, it's been an incredible enabler. And the last thing I'll say before we transition over is Garfield mentioned inclusion champions and our CEO Inclusion Council. They sit on our steering team. And the question that we pose to each other is, how can the ERNs create value for the business groups, the staff groups, and the functions? And how can the business staff groups and functions create value for the ERNs? So I'm gonna leave it there.
And I can ask so many more questions around that, but I do want us to transition so we can hear from Dr. James and Dr. Coger, and want to hear about the partnership. We talked a lot about partnerships and relationships. So I want to hear about the partnership between 3M and North Carolina A&T. So I'm well aware that this is not a new partnership. So this is one that there's some history behind. So would love to hear either Garfield or Scott a little bit more about the history, but then specifically there was a new announcement just made on Monday. So hot off the presses, a new initiative where this relationship is elevating to another level. So would love to hear more about that as well.
Garfield, do you want me to hit the history really quickly?
Go ahead, Scott.
So North Carolina A&T, Aggie pride. Folks say, Scott, you went to Michigan State. You did? I think I went to A&T. But this relationship goes back over 20 years. And it was one of 4 historically Black colleges that we started to have a recruiting development partnership with around sales and marketing, principally sales. And so that has been the relationship for all that time. I have been blessed to sit on the College of Business and Economics Executive Advisory Council for the past 10 years. And as Dean James and Dean Coger will tell you, have constantly tried to figure out ways that we can elevate the value that we're creating for the university and the students. And so at our last board meeting, our board meeting last spring, last year, this concept came up that we're going to be talking more about today. And when the proposition came, it was happened before George Floyd, but when it was time to really have the first conversations, it was after. And so my thought as we brought it into 3M stakeholders, that this could be the perfect time, or this time it could be way off. And I'll let Dean James and Dean Coger take it from here, but it's just a valuable partnership. And we can't, here's one thing I would say, and I said this the other day, what North Carolina A&T did for us, they caused us to peak in a different way. They challenged and stretched us to really rethink how we were going to go about social justice. And on so many levels, so many fruits were birthed out of this partnership. And as Garfield will attest, it's foundational. This is the start. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dean James and Dean Coger. Or your questions, Renee?
I wanted to make sure that we include the announcement that was recently made on Monday that speaks to the new initiative. So Garfield, if you'd like to give a little context to that, and then we'll turn it over to Dean James and Coger.
Yeah, no, again, I am just thrilled that we took this over the hump, over the finish line. And as Scott mentioned, it's been a journey that we've been on, building up on a long-term relationship, but this time taking it to the next level. And I think, creating a partnership where it's not just about writing a check. It's about a true partnership. It's about how do we go hand in hand, day in, day out, year after year, to make sure, as I'd mentioned earlier, we're really transforming the lives of those that are going to be benefiting from these programs across these 2 colleges. So it talks about, us showing up as a company with our capability. How do we mentor? How do we help with case studies, right? How are we, showing up on their campuses? How do we bring them into our labs so that they can be learning on the ground from us? So it's a true partnership. And I think something that, that I think we'll continue to learn from, but I really implore other companies to lean in and have this kind of depth of partnership, because if we're really going to be staying the course and really transforming lives and making that long-term impact, the partnership has to be different. It's not a check writing, a competition anymore. It's our own, let's roll our sleeves up and get to work.
Yes, as a colleague and I like to say, it's pens down, sleeves up. Put the pen down. I mean, sign the check first and then put the pen down and then roll up your sleeves and let's get to work. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's really about relationship and partnership. And I'm so glad, Scott, that you spoke about how long this relationship has gone. So this is not just a, fly by night, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year thing, but this is a deep thing. So Dean James and Dean Coger, I am so excited to hear from you. So much has been said both on, kind of what 3M has done leading up to this conversation, as well as about the history of your relationships. I really want to hear from you and I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of all HBCUs. I'm just asking you to speak on behalf of your department and North Carolina A&T. What does this type of initiative, what does this type of relationship mean to your schools and to the students? And we'll start with Dean Coger.
Oh, I was going to start with Dean James because the relationship with 3M actually began with our DEAS, College of Business and Economics. But before I turn it over to him, what I will say is that 3M's investment in North Carolina A&T's really equity in education initiative is really a testimony to the fact that so much about 3M and our university is aligned. When we were listening to Scott talk, and he mentioned how the ERNs and the responsibility that they take in making sure they're reaching out to the community. And so not only within the company, but also to the communities around the company, those elements are aligned with what HBCUs do all the time, but it's also aligned with what universities that are land grant universities do. And we are a land grant university and HBCU here at North Carolina A&T. And so there's just so much, not only from the business imperative and the engineering imperative, but so many other dimensions of why great partners are 3M with A&T. But as I said, this particular initiative is very special, but because it began with the College of Business and Economics, we're gonna let Dean James first give you the start of it, and I'll take it from him.
Sounds good. Dean James?
Yeah, so I'll share. Your question was what it means to our college, to our students.
Yes.
One of the things that I'll say is that it's very important because it represents a shift in my mind of about what these partnerships can look like in a couple of ways. So one way I'll say, one of the things that Scott indicated in his comments was that a shift in 3M was that they truly began to listen and understand, and that was a mechanism for change. I'm paraphrasing in less eloquent words, but essentially what he indicated. One of the things that's really different about this partnership is from my experience, the corporate relationships with a lot of HBCU business schools has been very superficial. It's been seeking talent. Or maybe it's been engaging in resume reviews, mock interviews, those kinds of things. And then when a company decided to engage at a deeper level, it was generally internally the company coming together and saying, here's something we would like to do and where we think we can make a difference. Let's push this out to these HBCU business schools and make a difference that way. One of the unique things about the way this was formed was indeed 3M's openness and listening and learning from our experience and our understanding of the barriers facing students that we see day to day. And then saying, okay, let's look at the barriers you're facing, looking at the problem. Let's look at who you are, who we are, and how can we bring all of this together to actually address the barriers to success that you're seeing. And the other thing, to Garfield's point, is that it is a deeper integration. It's not just writing a check. It's engaging the company's talents and competencies, and it's engaging in a way that really builds our capacity to address those systemic barriers, unlike a lot of the partnerships that we've seen in the past.
Excellent. Thank you, Dean James. Dean Coger, did you want to add anything to that?
The listening and the collaboration and the partnership is, I think, very important to underline. You cannot assume, you talked about the monolithic assumptions that so many people made about any other group that's different than themselves. And so what we're doing here doesn't mean that you do the exact same thing and apply it somewhere else, but it doesn't mean you do the same approach of having the conversation and collaborating on designing what works best so that it's a win-win for 3M and a win-win for us. And a win-win for us at North Carolina A&T is always going to be how it benefits our students and ensures not only their academic success, but also their professional success post degree. And that's what this does. And we are so grateful for 3M for taking the time to listen to what we were wanting to design and then deciding that it was so aligned with their interest that they wanted to invest in us. So we do appreciate it.
Excellent. I do want to pull the thread on that listening, the collaboration, the partnership piece. You know, we have a lot of our corporate partners who are joining us on the call today, and we'll have access to the recording afterwards, many of which who too have given checks to HBCUs, again, which is fantastic. But one of the questions that I always ask myself is, and then what? So after the check is written, you know, after the funding is given, after the funding is spent, you know, after the relationship has been signed, sealed, delivered, then what? So what happens to the curriculum? What happens to the reasons that the schools are in the place in the first place? What happens to the things that, you know, the universities have to then deal with back in the community where they are with students, and then with their local legislation or with other systems, you know, that they have to navigate to. So what suggestions, what thoughts would you leave with us to consider when it comes to building relationships and truly having partnership and collaboration, again, toward dismantling unjust systems? You know, that's the reason for the conversation. So what are the suggestions or ideas that you would leave us with that we need to be thinking about specific to relationships with HBCUs and really going beyond?
No, absolutely. I think any university, HBCU or otherwise, welcomes a corporation saying, we see your value and we're going to invest in you. But I would ask corporations to begin to look a little bit closer at how they're investing to determine the inequities in that. And what that means is that if it's only because it's the alma mater of your CEO that you write a $1 billion check without any kind of strings, but then when it's an HBCU, a $100 check is supposed to be thought of as, see, we're investing. That is inequity. And the way you're tying strings is also inequity. Now, that's different than this particular partnership. This particular partnership is substantial, and it is not just writing a check. 3M is indeed a partner, and there's things we're doing together over the next few years to make sure that we're continuing to deepen the relationship. Because as it was said before, you have to have understanding, but you also have to have a relationship. And while 3M has been a relationship at North Carolina A&T for so many years, the truth is there's so many dimensions to who we are as a university. So we're going to be using this time of this particular dimension of this partnership to make sure we're also building those bridges of connectivity that allow us to have even deeper relationships. You know, as Scott would say, this is only the beginning of what we're going to be able to do together. So.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I mean, what Dean Coger said is exactly right, and if you build those relationships the right way, and it's you know, it's a deep and sustainable relationship. It's a relationship with the company, not with a relationship with a person at the company. So if that person transitions or somehow you know, moves out of the position, you lose the relationship. But you've got a good relationship with the company that's long term. That's helpful. And the other thing that I would say is that this partnership that we're working with 3M on, we've been intentional about embedding things programmatically that are that we are institutionalizing, right? Things that will be sustained long term, because we're creating institutional change in the way that certain things are done, and we're learning things that we hope to you know, that's starting in the Dees College of Business and Economics and the College of Engineering, but that we hope to share with the rest of the university so that the impact spreads.
Dean James, would you be able to share specific concrete examples of that? So when you talk about, you know, you're kind of recreating the infrastructure for this sustained type of collaboration, what's a specific example? What does that look like in practice? What's something that shifted internally within the HBCU, or what's something to add a little more color to that?
Well, I'll say one thing that I think is a significant change is the way that we're thinking about partnerships with outside organizations and bringing in partners to elevate the effectiveness of what we're doing, whether that's enhancing mentoring programs, enhancing coaching, you know, executive coaching, enhancing our ability to connect students with opportunities, with companies, and create networks for them to create opportunities. But I think we're leveraging those partnerships in a new way, and being enabled to do that partly because of the ways that 3M is engaging with us.
Excellent, thank you for that. And Dean Coger, I have another question for you, but before I ask it, I do want to invite our friends in the audience to please, if you have questions, pop them in the chat. We'll be able to take some audience questions here in a second. But Dean Coger, you had mentioned earlier, tying strings is an inequity. So I want to come back to that. For folks who may not be aware, sometimes we operate, and with our implicit biases, we're not aware of how we are, causing or contributing to inequities. Can you illustrate, kind of top of mind, what do some of the strings look like that we might not even be aware, our strings?
Sure. Let me figure out a way to do this kind of generally.
Yeah.
So let's say that in one university, you give to, I don't know, find a building, a new building, a facility that will exist at that university. And once you give to that university, you just say, I trust them to build the building and do what they plan to do there. But then at this other university, you don't give anywhere close to that, but you're expecting almost the world for such a less amount. So that's an inequity, not only in the amount, but also in the fact that you almost feel as though your smaller investment deserves more than you are requiring of your larger investment. But your whole thought process is different because it's a different kind of institution. The fact is that HBCUs have been, from the time of their institutions, have been underfunded compared to so many of their counterparts. So, and yet across the nation, we produce at such a high level and such quality graduates. So when you think about who we are as institutions and who North Carolina A&T is as an institution, we have a record of producing just great talent. And yet that talent has got to be invested in, because to do what we do as an institution requires partnerships and investments. And so what I would love for companies to think about in generally is that be a part of the solution by actually having the conversations and helping to produce even more of the wonderful output that you are seeking to recruit. And when you do that, it not only helps your company and the nation, but it has so many great minds that will be invested in creating innovative and the kinds of solutions that you need to make sure that your company continues to be on the cutting edge. So those are the ways you want people to think. Realize that you have to invest in the result that you want to see.
Right. No different than the investment, as you eloquently stated, is being made at other, PWI institutions, for instance. I think one of the things that really struck me in what you said is that the caliber and the quality of product, if you will, so graduates from HBCUs, is on par with any other PWI, Ivy League, institution. Yet there is a huge gap, disparity in the resources, in the investment, in the technology, if you will, and so many things. But yet HBCUs are still doing more with less, quite frankly, and that continues to be the case. So I'm really interested in how do we turn that tide and change that thing so that there is equitable, kind of coming from equal footing, if you will, toward that. One of the things that I do want to hear from you, Dean James and Coger, is around the HBCU ecosystem, generally speaking. One of the things that when I often think about HBCUs, I think they're such a tall order. Students come into HBCUs to receive an education, right? No different than any other university. But I think the students that come into HBCUs have to receive so much more. They're receiving the history that wasn't taught in their K-12 textbooks. They're receiving support, from a community level in a different way. Oftentimes, there is a larger number of first generation students. So there is a lot of, kind of legacy challenges that come along with that. So there's so much more, I believe, that's baked into an HBCU education that is often overlooked. So I want to hear from you as we talk about partnerships and we're talking about changes. What have you noticed in the HBCU ecosystem, generally speaking, that is shifting, that you get excited about and that you see really leading towards sustainable change and impact? And this is open to anyone, actually, but I really want to hear from Dean Coger and James first.
You want me to start?
Sure.
I am excited that the social justice time of now has made companies really have more quality conversations. For some, it's a eureka moment. Not for us, for them. But to have the quality of the conversation does indeed matter. What the test will be is realizing that it's not just a moment. What we're talking about and what we're doing and the work that we're about is really about the future of the country and the future of so many industries. Well, you know what, it's Engineers Week, everyone. And I have to mention that. It's Engineers Week this week. And so we had an event last night and one of our alumni on the panel that I facilitated reminded everyone that if you were building a successful professional team, you don't want everyone to be the same type of player. You need people to have so many different roles in order to be a winning team. Well, isn't that really why you have diversity and inclusion? Why you have such diverse minds around the table? Yes, you need them to know their content. And that's what our institutions do. That's what happens in the Dees College of Business and Economics. That's what happens in our College of Engineering at North Carolina A&T. Our students know their content, but they also have this other additional point of view that comes from the trajectory and the path that they took. And so isn't that who you want around the table? So that when you're thinking about new products, you're coming up with ideas that never occurred to you because you didn't have who you needed to have around the table to be competitive in that way. Right. So I'll start there. This is a story. We can do a whole hour on this, but
I know.
And what I would indicate is very similar. It's the thing that I'm excited about most is that whether we're talking about corporations, professional organizations, whoever, that there's very much a new openness to understanding the value that we bring and understanding what we do and our contribution to social and economic mobility, et cetera. And I think that has also resulted in differences in how some at HBCUs see themselves. Because, if you're treated just like an individual, if you're treated like you have less value long enough, you begin to question your own, whether you really are as good or as valuable as a comparable PWI. And I think it's translated in some cases to people, kind of seeing themselves differently as well. So as Robin said, one of the things she said earlier was talking about the historic underfunding. And one of the things to understand is, North Carolina A&T has had 130 years of being underfunded. That being the case, there's no short-term level of funding that's going to compensate for 130 years of underfunding. This has to be a sustained effort, sustained partnerships, sustained investments.
Sustained commitment.
Right, sustained commitment if we're going to undo the inequities that have been prevalent for so long.
I just wanted to add here too, Renay, that, we've been talking a lot about listening and understanding. And, every time I hear that, it goes back to the framework that our CEO announced last May, that we're going to be intentional about listening, understanding, and acting. And as our CHRO says, add repeat on that, because it's a cycle. It's not a one-time event to listen, but we have to continually listen to our partners. And I think that's one of the biggest learnings that we've had. As a big global company, we could have decided to listen to ourselves. We have a lot of data and capability, but this time we had to be intentional about listening more broadly. And so when we brought in, our community coalition partners, right, they challenged us. They challenged us immensely. Because because they said, "Oh, 3M, it's great that you're going to be, investing in STEM education, but until you're able to address some of the basic family support needs of the families and the populations you want to serve, you won't get to the education. right? Just, similar to the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And so we had to say, wow, I mean, we weren't thinking of that. We were just focused on our STEM, STEM education investment. And so we really had to take a step back. And I'm really proud of the work of Michael Stork and our other leaders. We have now retooled our approach, our investment approach, our employee engagement approach to align with the fact that we not only listen, but we have greater understanding so that we can act in a way that's going to be sustainable. And the last thing I'll say is that when I was invited to the table for this North Carolina A&T University partnership, I'll tell you that where we've ended isn't where we started. And it's because we challenged each other, right? It took months, right? It wasn't a one and done. It was a series of conversations over a period of time that has gotten us to what I believe is the right place to really, get going with this deeper relationship. So just wanted to offer those sentiments, Renay.
And so, Renay, I'll just add one additional build. It's the fact that we were ready for this moment. And I would tell you in 2017 or prior to that, we would not have been ready for this moment. And so what's most important now, and I've heard it echoed throughout this conversation, is we're ready to seize it, right? We're ready to be disruptive and sustainable in all that we do. And I think it's so fitting, this rhetoric to action, because we're all about action. And so on so many levels in prior times, we've been maybe in a position to react. Now I think we position ourselves, particularly together, to be proactive. And that's a difference, because now we can be out front and lead and set a standard.
Thank you for adding that. I'm mindful of time. We only have a couple minutes left. And as I imagine, we could easily have a 4-hour conversation, if not longer, around this. So much to say. I do want to make sure that we at least get to 1 or 2 questions, but I have to kind of come back to Scott, what you just said. We're ready for this moment. And to me, that says you have to put in the work to lay the foundation. We cannot expect, and I don't think anyone is expecting, corporations or anyone to just jump in and go and change things immediately. It takes time, and that's okay. Take the time that is needed to really understand where you are, where you're starting from, and then take a step toward action, toward movement. But I think understanding where you're coming from is probably the most prudent place to start, because you can't build a house on a, rocky foundation or one that's crumbling, which I've seen happen and I've seen tried, and it won't last. It won't work. The other thing that I think, Garfield, you mentioned is where we ended isn't where we started. So be open to the journey. I think one of the other themes that I've heard is reciprocal learning. You've learned from each other. It's not just 3M coming and saying, here, we're going to do this, or NCA&T saying, you should do that. It's about let's learn with each other and from each other as we grow. So I just want to pull that thread very quickly. But as promised, I am going to hop over to the questions. We do have a question for 3M in particular, wondering if intentional inclusion metrics are part of performance management at 3M. So Garfield or Scott, can you touch on that?
They are as effective 2020. So for managers, that came out of our CEO inclusion project. And so, yes, they are. So it's a great question.
Excellent. Thank you. And another question around employee kind of connectedness. How does 3M ensure that employees are not overburdened in this way and can devote time toward the social justice initiatives that they're passionate about, but not at the expense of the work that they are meant to deliver on? So it kind of goes back to that integration piece.
Yeah, one of the beauties of 3M and, as an innovation company, we've always had the principle of a 20% time, right? Many of our products, or several of our products, the Post-it included, came out of the fact that folks were just given the flexibility to use 1% of their time to advance an area that they're passionate about. There it is, there you go, Dean Coger, right? And so that still exists. And so I've got folks from Asia reaching out to me to say, can I use my 20% time? Yes. Go advance equity in the places and spaces where you can have an influence and have an impact. And so just wanted to offer that in response to say, folks are empowered to do work, but do work in an aligned way, right? Because we don't want to, and so that's why we have a framework. We've not prescribed, but we've had a framework around equity. So now we can grab the framework and go, mobilize a movement around that and localize as appropriate.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We do have some really good questions that have come through the chat, but unfortunately we are at time. So if our panelists agree, I would love to be able to send some of these questions your way to get your feedback, and then we can distribute them to our attendees. Dean James, Dean Coger, Scott, Garfield, thank you so much. As imagined, I know this would be a good conversation, and I know we could have gone so much longer, but I thank you for your time. I thank you for your honesty and your candor. And I thank you for sharing your experiences with us.
It's an honor to be here, and thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Absolute honor. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Renee.
This
Sure.
recording will be shared out, so everyone will have access to it. And of course, if you have any questions, you can feel free to contact me. And I believe my information should be in the chat. With that, I will wish you all a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one, babe.
Bye-bye.